I'm going to start with a welcome now. I see people are still trickling in, so apologies to those who only join a little bit later, but welcome. And thank you so very much for joining us to this webinar on the Russian invasion in Ukraine. For those who have been following the news, you know that fighting is ongoing and that the Ukrainian President Zelensky has just addressed the European Parliament, for example. This is, by the way, only one of 3 events at the EUI this week. So we will talk about the invasion today, but then there's also an event on sanctions on Thursday, the 3rd of March at noon with Sony Kapoor, and then another one on Friday at the School of Transnational Governance at 11 a.m., a conversation with Sir Robert Cooper. So to shed light onto the invasion from different angles, it's a great pleasure to have 3 distinguished speakers with us today. We have Oksana Antonenko, who you see, at least for me, in, no, sorry, this corner over here. She's director at Control Risks, a risk consultancy. Before that, she has been a colleague of Dana's at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also has worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. She has expertise on countries such as Russia, Turkey, but also countries in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Central Asia. And in her work, actually, she uses methodologies such as stakeholder mapping, risk analysis, but also scenario building. So we might ask her a few questions to look for us into the future. Dana Allin, who's here as well, he's Senior Fellow for US Foreign Policy on Transatlantic Affairs, and he's also the editor of Survival at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and an adjunct professor at SAIS in Bologna. And we very much look forward to draw on his expertise on US foreign policy and the transatlantic relationship. And then thirdly, we have Vladimir who's professor at the European University at St. Petersburg, as well as distinguished professor at the Finnish Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Helsinki. And he has worked on Russian and post-Soviet politics, in particular with attention to political regime dynamics and policy making. So to all 3 of you, thank you so very much for having taken the time to speak to us today. Let me very, very briefly outline how we intend to run this webinar before I hand over actually to Philipp, who's going to start us off with the first question. So Philipp Genschel and I, Stephanie Hofmann, we're going to moderate the roundtable with 4 questions. And we will alternate asking these questions to our 3 participants of the roundtable before we then open up to you, the audience, to ask further questions. For actually answering questions, we'd ask you to use the Q&A function that you can see on Zoom. So there is no chat function here today. So please use the Q&A and you can actually upvote certain questions. So if you like a question that you see very much, upvote it and it will appear further up on the screen for us to read it out to our participants. So again, thank you so much for taking the time. And Philipp, please start us off with the first question.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. And the first question simply is, how did we get here? Until very recently, many took for granted that a major land war in Europe was impossible. But now we have one. How did it come to this? Let me start by asking Vladimir why the Russian government decided to engage in a large-scale invasion of the Ukraine. Who were the actors involved and what were the major decision points in the decision process?
Yeah, let me start from a little bit of personal comment. I'm a Russian citizen, and I feel myself deeply ashamed for what my country did and continued to do toward Ukraine. It's unacceptable for whatever reasons of humanity, and it is a gravest political mistake and pernicious decision made by the Russian government or the Russian president. However, I wouldn't say that it just popped up quite unexpected. Because there is a long-standing personalist authoritarian regime led by a militant leader, Vladimir Putin, for more than 20 years. It is a very strong post-imperial Soviet resentment, which was used as a powerful tool of both domestic politics and foreign policy. And Russia attempted to impose its control over Ukraine for a number of years. There were two episodes of overthrow of pro-Russian Ukrainian regimes in 2004 and 2014. And there was an annexation of Crimea, a frozen or nearly frozen conflict in Donbass, and so on and so forth. However, the most recent developments were quite unexpected for many observers, including myself. And it is a need to reconsider the logic of decision making. Certainly, one of the important elements that Putin is very much in free hands of unconstrained approach to decision making. And this is typical for many personalist regimes. And given the poor quality of expertise and very irrelevant expectations that Ukrainian leadership is puppet of the United States, of NATO, and the very first attack of Russians will immediately overthrow the regime was entirely wrong. And I would say that overall in defense and foreign policy, there is a number of episodes of bad governance from the top to the bottom. And this is why the Russian military was completely unprepared to perform this task of overthrow the regime overnight. But more generally, there is a problem of misperceptions of Russian leadership towards Ukraine with regard to state weakness, with regard to ethnic nationalism and the like. And these misperceptions gave an impression that it would be really easy to overthrow the government and keep the country over the Russian control. Actually, it is wrong. And finally, the Russian leadership became a victim of its own success, as in 2014, the annexation of Crimea was completely bloodless, was greatly applauded by residents of Crimea, and sanctions imposed by the US and by the EU were not that much difficult for the Russian elites and for society at large. Now the situation is completely different, and what we might expect is aggravation of these issues in coming days or weeks or months or even years and decades. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Vladimir. Let me turn to Dana. When was it that you realized for the first time that a major war was possible and indeed likely? And what made you think so? And do you think that there would have been any point at which this war could have been prevented?
Well, to your first question, for weeks now, I can't even remember, or months, the Biden administration has been saying with a rather remarkable information campaign, employing and revealing intelligence that it took seriously, and we obviously should have taken seriously that this was going to happen, that this was the Russian plan, and not always with the caveat that they couldn't actually know exactly what was in Vladimir Putin's mind, but they had pretty good evidence that this was pretty good intelligence that this is what he was planning. Having said that, you asked me a personal question. I mean, I guess to be perfectly honest, it was when I was on my way to Bologna in a taxi going to Heathrow when I saw a Thursday morning that the war had started. So with all the buildup, with all the accessibility to reality, the shock of reality was nonetheless real. Now to the question, could anything have been done to stop it? I mean, this is obviously a big question. The uber question of how did we get here? I mean, I want to start by saying the most fundamental answer is because the Russian state led and in some sense embodied by, or in a large sense embodied by Vladimir Putin, decided that an independent Ukraine was intolerable. And I wouldn't want anything I say in the next minutes or the next 90 minutes to be misunderstood as not recognizing that moral reality and the monstrosity of the invasion. Now, having said that, it's also true in somewhat tautological terms that NATO and the West failed to create a post-war security architecture that adequately accommodated Russia. I say tautological because, if we have the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War, although I think Chechnya also counts, but NATO in some sense failed. That doesn't mean, however, by any measure that this is NATO or the West's fault, and it may have failed because the task was impossible. Now, I personally, together with a lot of so-called realists, have long argued that NATO enlargement, or let me put it this way, that NATO could have and should have done more to understand and address legitimate Russian security concerns, and that the principle of an open process of NATO enlargement to include, in theory, every country on Russia's border was inherently destabilizing. And I still think that that argument and that worry is valid in theory, but I'm not sure it makes much difference in practice. And of course, there are powerful counter arguments. First of all, that NATO was not in any real sense threatening to Russia. And of course, that enlargement was demand driven by East and Central European states, countries that who maybe knew better than anybody else what they were likely to face in terms of Russian revanchism. And we can add to this, counter argument, the considerable evidence since sometime, well towards the beginning of this century, that Putin's real concern wasn't NATO, but rather more generally Ukraine's Western orientation and even, if I can use these words, democratic development. Now, of course, all of these things can be true at once. That's the tragedy of the security dilemma, and I don't think it's something we should lose sight of. But having said that, for very understandable reasons, I'm not really, in much of a mood to run up the anti-NATO enlargement banner right now, because I think that the enormity of what's happening demands we look at the real perpetrator of what's going on. Finally, if I have just 10 more seconds, there has been and there will probably be a lot of discussion about the failures and the robustness of or lack thereof of Western deterrence. And again, I mean, speaking tautologically, it has failed. And it's possible that Russia in general, Putin in particular, may not have anticipated the kind of unified Western response he's seen. Obviously, not to mention the courage and the skill and the patriotism of the Ukrainian resistance. I would be very cautious, however, about ascribing this failure to any particular Western or American failure to effectively bluff at any time in the past. The whole argument about Obama's red line in Syria or Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. I mean, we can talk about this. I don't think it's actually very fruitful, but I don't have time to sort of explain why I don't think it's particularly important.
Thank you. So let me turn to Oksana and the very recent history, namely the 5 or 5.5 days of war. Vladimir has already talked about Russian misperceptions. So apparently there were military surprises for Russia. If you recapitulate the past 5 days, what would you say were the most important events that shaped the campaign and shaped the military situation on the ground right now?
Well, thank you very much for this question. If I may, maybe also to try to follow these excellent presentations by both previous speakers, to add a little bit of my vision on what led to it, in a bit of a longer term, but then focus on what actually is happening on the ground now. But let me also to start by saying that this is a terrible tragedy for Ukraine. It is a terrible tragedy for European security, and it is something which, of course, for many generations of Russians will be a terrible tragedy, and we all, of course, all our thoughts with people of Ukraine at the moment. In terms of what really when this crisis started, and I think we need to really think about in our own minds when they think about why it was not possible to deter. I mean, President Putin and Russia to stage this full-scale invasion, and whether we really had opportunities along the way to stop it. For me, the start of this crisis, of course, we can look back at the whole NATO enlargement and the failure to create a Cold War order in which Russia could have had a more comfortable place. But of course, we have to also acknowledge that there were opportunities for Russia to improve its place in the European order, but it hasn't taken them. I think the demand from Russia ever since President Putin came to power in the year 2000, maybe with the exception of very early on, when there was some discussions, and he acknowledged it, that he mentioned it to the NATO Secretary General and to Clinton also, that maybe Russia could become a member of NATO, something which was very quickly dismissed. But all throughout the rest of the history, really, from Russia, the message was always very clear, that if Russia wants to join the European security system, it would be not on the basis of equal participant. It will be on the basis of if not equal to United States, but very close second as a nuclear power, as a member of the Security Council. And there was simply no opportunity for Russia to join this European security system on this basis, because as we know, the European security system is based around participation and consensus and collective security, but not the security which is decided by individual member states. So in that sense, it is not only that on the Western side, maybe some opportunities were missed with structuring relationship with Russia around NATO and other issues, to include it. But it's also very clear that under President Putin, it was always seen that Russia's role in European security has to be one which has veto over decisions and pathways of many of the European nations, something which was entirely unacceptable. The second point to make, this immediate crisis, when did it start? And for me, it really started from the start of the Biden administration, because, of course, President Putin, during the time of the Trump administration, has always put on the table already then this idea that Russia is now, after Crimea, after getting, exactly as Vladimir said, certain success and prominence for intervention in Syria, was looking for a strategic bargain in Europe, and a strategic bargain that Russia wanted to agree with United States. Of course, you know, during the Trump administration, maybe Trump was open to these ideas, but he wasn't able to deliver. But when the Biden came to the White House, you know, there was immediately signaling. So we've seen Russia started building up its forces near Ukraine's border at the beginning of the year, you know, and this was when the first stage of this crisis really started. And of course, what did we see in terms of the response from Washington? We saw the summit, which in a way kind of rewarded this build-up on the Russian side, you know, by United States, and a summit in which, of course, the Biden administration has proposed the relationship, which is built around this idea of red lines. So let's, you know, draw the red lines on both sides, and I think what we then had is a response from Putin, who very much sees the world through red lines. This is very much a kind of a concept of international relations that he very much understands, of Russia trying to sort of raise the stakes and draw those red lines. And already, you know, with around the, obviously after Afghanistan, you know, in the summer, we've seen Russia starting to draw those red lines, both from the buildup of forces, with all the things that it was doing in terms of European energy equation, you know, raising the price of energy, restricting supplies to kind of gain leverage in this red line diplomacy. So it is, you know, of course, eventually led us to the situation where when talks really started, you know, Putin then put maximalist demands on the table with this ultimatum, which obviously was absolutely clear that nobody would be able to deliver. While at the same time, of course, you know, the U.S. administration, the Biden administration has proposed a number of ideas which could have been really, you know, seen as a massive concessions to Russia. They could have been taken and packaged by President Putin as a major, you know, strategic success, that he received certain proposals on, you know, inspections in Romania and Poland, on non-deployment of weapons on territory of Ukraine, on negotiations on legally binding limitations on missiles. The whole package, you know, could have been presented, but because at that time it was all about red lines, I think, you know, he moved on. And then, of course, we now see the situation in which, you know, the whole deterrence strategy, which was built around, you know, three pillars really. The first one is to you know, clearly threaten sanctions, and exactly as Vladimir said, you know, on the Russian side, you know, there was no you know, perception that sanctions are something which is going to influence President Putin's calculations. And of course, there was also incorrect, we know, perception that the West will not be united, which of course we know now that the West is completely united now. And the second, this information deterrence, you know, again, something which the assumption was that the more, you know, Putin's plans are put in the open and called out, the more likely he is going to hold back. But of course, for him, you know, this is whole information operation is targeted at his own people. It is for you know, internally in Russia, and therefore he did exactly what was said in the information. So he staged those flag operations, he did everything, and eventually went on with a full-scale invasion. So it wasn't at all a deterrence. So it is really very hard to see how this crisis could have been deterred at this stage.
Thank you. On to Stephanie.
Thank you, Philip. And just for those who have joined a little later, just so you know, at this roundtable, we're going to ask a few questions to the participants, but at the same time, we opened up the Q&A, and many questions have been already trickling in. So feel free to ask the questions, and we'll use them for not only the Q&A, but I'm going to actually pick two already as well, because they fit into the question I wanted to ask. The broad question here really is, who are the actors, and what do they want? And Vladimir, if I may, first to you, when we look to Russia, we see a political apparatus that doesn't tolerate much political opposition. So who besides Putin actually are the main actors in planning and executing this invasion, and what do they want? And what can civil society in Russia do? And this actually feeds into a question also asked by Fergal Trenor, who really would like to know whether actually Putin and his inner circle, whether we still can call them a rational decision makers or not. And also Jonah Schulhofer-Wohl, who's really interested into what specifically are Russia's security concerns when it comes to Ukraine. Please.
Yeah, thank you. basically Security Council approved decision made by Putin. And I'm not sure that there were serious, behind the scene, weighting of pro and contras of invasion. My understanding that these expectations were out of reality because of lack of institutionalized ways of decision making. At least as to annexation of Crimea, Putin confessed that the decision was done by him alone. And I doubt that it was somehow different in case of launching the war against Ukraine. On civil society, actually, there are numerous protests in Russia, and these protests came from different circles. For example, I saw today a collective petition of restaurant owners, and they requested to stop the war because they will face heavy losses. Certainly, we usually not identify restaurant owners with anti-war protesters, but this case is very much special. The problem is that there is, at least at the very beginning, visible support of Russia's militant actions toward Ukraine, driven by propaganda, numerous grievances, and the like. But my understanding is that things may turn differently rather quickly as economic conditions may worsen severely, and it will affect virtually everyone. And this may change popular expectations. But the question is how popular expectations may affect Putin's domestic capacity, and we don't know yet how it may work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a question to both Dana and Oksana, because I mean, many have been dragged into this war who actually want peace, stability. But however, beyond this broad goal, what are they prepared to do and with what kind of means? So maybe we go in the same order. If Dana, you might want to address this first, maybe with view also onto the Transatlantic Alliance and the US, and then Oksana, I don't know whether you want to maybe more talk about Central and Eastern European countries.
Well, what are the Western powers and the alliance prepared to do? I mean, you know, the first thing to say is that, you know, just to endorse what Oksana said earlier, which is fairly obvious and still very noteworthy, which is that the West, NATO, the European Union have all done a lot. I mean, the response has been extremely unified. I think it's very difficult for me, I mean, maybe Oksana can help out here, but it's very difficult for me to find much fault with the with the Biden administration's leadership in this crisis. And frankly, part of that leadership has been what was derisively called leading from behind. I mean, in certain respects, in the sense that as the sanctions have been rolled in, and the US has kind of intentionally taken a back seat to see how far its European partners would be willing to go and what they would do, and then it's backstopping. So I think this has been all extremely well managed. Now, how far will they go? I mean, it's you know, it's an extremely dangerous situation requiring great care. I mean, first of all, the whole question I mean, I'm sort of referring, there's a poem by Larkin that said, our minds, to paraphrase, we retreat to those small things we are the master of. So, I'll go back to the somewhat arcane debate about Ukrainian membership in NATO in the future. One thing that's clear is that NATO is not going to defend Ukraine right now, and it's not directly, and it's not going to do it because Russia is a nuclear superpower. I mean, there are other reasons, but I mean, that's the fundamental reason. And, we've really stepped up to the line of war with Russia. And the various steps that will include, I mean, looking forward, and I think maybe Oksana will talk about this but a bit more, but looking forward to what might happen in coming weeks if Kiev falls, if you're looking at a long-term insurgency with Western support, with NATO support, that it too is going to be a very dangerous situation. So I'm not, I'm in favor of all these things, including, I think, the latter. But we have to recognize that we're talking about an extremely perilous confrontation with nuclear possibilities.
Okay, so I'll try to augment this, a little bit. Who are the key actors now? From my point of view, the key actors is, Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people, because against all odds and all the forecasts and all the assessments and objective military balance, we actually seen Ukrainian people mobilizing and being able to very effectively defend their country and deny so far Russia any substantial military advances, at least not, military advances that will come without a very, very substantial escalatory cost. And of course, we know that any, bombardments or indiscriminate attack against large urban centers is going to reverberate, and large civilian casualties that are going to, that attack will entail, will reverberate not only internationally, but also within Russia itself, because clearly the narrative that is still being fed to the Russian people through the propaganda machine is that, Russia is just targeting military facilities. A major campaign to take over 5 million people city of Kiev, or even 1.5 million Kharkiv, is going to be a completely different ballgame. So, whether the Ukrainian people will be able to hold on and then keep the military situation on the ground such that will open opportunities for talks, for ceasefire talks, is very crucial. Another players, I think, which we oftentimes discount, and I think Vladimir mentioned that, there are players within Russia that are clearly also have an influence on the situation. In the current environment, it's mostly the Russian military. Again, we've seen a lot of reports, from the ground, from social media, elsewhere, that the morale in the Russian military is very low. We've seen, of course, that performance, very poor. Of course, we know that there's been a lot of elite Russian forces that have not yet been deployed, and they're coming in. But clearly, it is also the reaction within the Russian military to what is going on and what is expected of them, including, potential order to, inflict mass casualties on the city where a lot of them have their relatives and friends. So the second one, of course, Vladimir mentioned, elites generally in Russia and the impact of sanctions on them. I mean, clearly the current sanctions are by far more severe and have an immediate impact. The whole kind of narrative that President Putin had now for many years, that his biggest achievement within Russia, that he brought stability, predictability financially, and certain degree of the development and stability, security to people. This is all out of the window, because with the sanctions on Russia's reserves, Russia will have very limited capacity at the moment to defend, against those sanctions, and they will trickle in very, very quickly to the broader population. And the third actor, which is very important, is the public opinion in the West. We all remember the Balkans wars, where there was a lot of reluctance to go further. I think the public opinion, if we are going to see what United Nations now forecasting potentially 4 million Ukrainians crossing the border into Poland and further on into Europe, and if we see it, and this conflict, unlike conflict in Syria, is being covered 24/7 to the screens of every household in the West, again, very similar to the Balkan wars, which we really have not seen since then. So the public opinion pressure is going to be very, very severe on their governments to do something to stop it. And therefore, we've seen really in the space of, think about it, 5 days or less, 3 days now, countries, like Germany, even countries like Finland, are now providing military assistance to Ukraine, something which we have not really would have thought, ever to happen. And this military assistance is becoming more substantial, more lethal, and more significant. So clearly we are still at the early stages of escalation, but it is very clear that the West is not going to respond to this crisis, particularly if we see more spillovers, through the means which does not include further military support for Ukraine. And as long as the Ukrainians are fighting, not just in a guerrilla fashion, but actually fighting in an organized way, this support is going to grow. As you know, European Union is providing now military jets to Ukraine. This is a very substantial military assistance, and there will be more coming through.
Thank you so very much. Philipp, back to you.
Yes, actually following up on what Oksana just said, so public opinion in the West presses governments to do something. But, really what can be done to end the war, and by who? Basically, I think there are three basic ways in which the war could end. Either there is a military solution, some side wins in some meaningful sense of the word. Second, there's some kind of negotiated settlement. And third, Russia gives up. It backs down unilaterally. So I would like to explore with you the conditions under which all this is possible. And maybe I start with Oksana and ask her, how could a military victory of Russia look like? Would it be enough for Russia to simply take Ukraine, or are there additional demands? And what could the Ukrainian government do in order to prevent this? Would there even be a meaningful way to think about the Ukrainian victory in this? And what's the role of Western governments?
Yes, no, it's a very good question. I think the assumptions when this war just started was that Russia, just purely by very unequal military balance, obviously between Ukraine and Russia, will be able to secure a very quick victory. And that's what we hear, at least from Russian sources, was the Russian plan. They were planning to secure a victory within 3 to 4 days, by the end of the weekend. They were planning to have full control over Kiev. And we know, if we look at the map at the moment, Russia doesn't really control any major cities. And those cities, small ones, even like secondary ones, where Russia is established sort of control in the sense that, they have forces there, they've taken down the Ukrainian flag. We see local population standing around those forces and, shouting at them and putting the flags back up. So obviously, this kind of mobilization of the population means that, you simply cannot have a kind of a military victory of the kind, which, on the Russian side, there was an assumption. Again, Vladimir quite rightly pointed out that perhaps there was a complete misunderstanding on the part of President Putin and many of the Russian elites, calling it all liberation, that Russian troops will be welcome, that there will be substantial pro-Russian actors who will be able to not only help them enable their victory, but also then provide a kind of network to be put in place to govern the country later on. Now we know for sure that there are no pro-Russian elements there who are prepared to welcome Russian forces at any level. And should Russia really bomb, of course they can bomb Kiev for many, many days and inflict, thousands of casualties. If they do that, how will they be able to govern the space? There will be no one who will be effectively, following Russia's orders and be able to govern. It will be even worse than what we've seen in Iraq following US occupation. So the military objective, that were put in front of people, Russian forces, I don't think at the moment is achievable. What I think at the moment, tactically, what we are really talking about here is for Russia to really securing, certain amount of, military kind of advances, which they can put on the table of negotiations. As you know, negotiations were now initiated by the Russian side, which I think is very significant. It's not the Ukrainians who ask for negotiations because they think that they're about to lose. It's the Russians who think that maybe things are not going exactly the way they thought they are, and also, the kind of demands that are now on the table, obviously from the Russian side, we know recognition of Crimea, removal of Ukrainian government and full neutrality. None of those demands will be acceptable now. I would even think that, even DNR, LNR might be taken off the table now, and of course, parts of the Ukrainian negotiating position now is that Crimea is not on the table at all. So I guess, Russia will have to substantially reformulate and its demands, and depending on what happens on the battlefield, I think we will see, how those demands are going to evolve. But I can certainly see that we could have a scenario, whereby Russia will have to very, very substantially reduce its demands, to the minimum, and Crimea may be the last thing that they will be wanting to hold on to, but probably most likely scenario that at the end of the day, this war will end up in a kind of settlement, which will maybe give Russia a little bit more territory, and certainly not control over Kiev and control of entire Ukraine.
Thank you. Now, if we turn to negotiated settlement, even if Russia adjusts its list of demands, as Oksana suggested, there's still the problem of lack of trust. What guarantees could Russia offer so that the Ukrainian government could trust the settlement? And second question, should Western countries use their leverage over the Ukraine to force the Ukraine to make concessions, for instance, territorial concessions, as Oksana just mentioned? Dana, would you like to start us on this?
Sure. I mean, before I address your questions, and you're actually going to have to remind me of the first one, but I was just struck by something that Oksana said that, made me remember why, despite all of the intelligence provided by the Biden administration, despite the apparent the extravagance of the Russian demands and the the nature of the buildup of forces, the reason that maybe we were still surprised, or at least I was still surprised on Thursday morning, shocked on Thursday morning that the war was actually happening, was just because of the political senselessness of it. It didn't make it. One couldn't see how Russia would be politically advantaged by invading and trying to conquer Ukraine. And Oksana has laid out, the realities of that brilliantly and very compellingly. And it leads me to the question of, did Putin and those around him really believe their own propaganda? I think, Oksana, you went up to the edge of saying yes, but I wonder if you would say that explicitly, because that puts us in a very, very opaque situation right now, because Putin himself, if the penny is dropping, if the truth is dawning on him, he probably hasn't figured out what he could go for, or what could be negotiated, or what a fallback position would be. I fear that, for lack of a fallback position, the answer is to keep going. If you can't win Ukraine, to obliterate it. That's a horrifying and tragic conclusion. I think one of your questions is, should Western powers, including the United States, be suggesting to Ukraine concessions? I'd be very, first of all, since the Ukrainians are doing so much of this on their own, I wonder how receptive they would be to any such message. And I'm not sure what concessions I would suggest. I mean, the de facto control of Crimea is, I don't know, that needs to be negotiated, because it's a fact. But at the end of the day, I think the most hopeful prospect is that there is some kind of off-ramp in front of which some fig leaf of symbolic accommodation could be reached. And I think there were reasonable people suggesting before the war that not a blanket renunciation of the NATO option, but a statement of moratorium or delay in moving forward with it. That was a reasonable thing, I think, to be suggesting before the invasion. Whether it would be a possibility now is something to consider.
Thank you. Now, Vladimir, the simple solution would, of course, be for Russia to back down. I guess that's very hard to imagine with Putin still in leadership. So is there any chance, and this is also the question by Philipp Kostelka, is there any chance of a coup d'etat so that Putin loses power?
Well, at least as of yet, there are no open signs of major disagreements among the elite. Of course, there are some business people who raise their concerns about the state of economy, but we don't see any open protests from the top level of the Russian elite. And I would say that this is a result of this personalistic control, long-standing use of sticks and carrots, and building very much of loyalty. It not necessarily means that it will be forever, and I believe that if Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian government will be able to stop the Russian military for a while, then these risks will increase. But please note that autocrats in many parts of the globe face with the same risks, and they usually tend to avert these risks through well, divide and rule practices of cursive apparatus, and this is what we observe in Russia. That well, there are several agencies in charge of security, the Ministry of Defense, Federal Security Service, National Guard, personal guard of Putin, and the like. So this means that collective actions of these agencies may be really dangerous and difficult for their leaders. And the second point, which is working towards the opposite direction, that there is a pretty stable leadership. All of the top military and security people are well, personal confidence of Putin. Some of them are long-standing Putin's allies for decades. And it may be very problematic for them to raise their voice or to bear their arms against the boss, especially given the fact that there is no exit choice for them. Imagine that, well, Putin will disappear, but then certainly top leadership of Kerchen apparatus will be blamed for the war to a great degree. And as they see no exit solution, they are very much sided with the leadership. This is the situation for now, but it will be difficult to predict how these elites may respond for further aggravation of the situation. And I can totally agree with Oksana that everything depends upon Ukrainian resistance. If it will be strong enough, then the cohesion of the Russian elite may be endangered. Otherwise, if Russians will be able to, I don't know, to eliminate Ukrainian people, this will be a clear sign of victory for Putin, regardless to price in terms of human lives and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So one more question before we address some of the questions from the audience. Thank you so much for posting all of these questions. They're very, very interesting. So it's a broad question, and it kind of requires you to look into your informed crystal ball. But the question we were wondering too was, where will it all end? So we already talked a bit of where you think in the medium term it could end for Russia, for Ukraine. But with that question, we were also wondering what you think are likely or the likely scenarios for the so-called European political economic security order. And Oksana, I know, first of all, you're the expert because you do scenario building. And second, you don't have much time left. You have to leave a little earlier. So why don't we address that question to you first? And then I would ask Vladimir and then Dana to answer the question as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you again for the invitation. Of course, it's very difficult. We just talked about, how the military situation is likely to evolve, to say, how it's all going to change. But I think some things have already changed, and very little is going to be reversed. The first thing that has changed, that the relationship between Russia and the West has now not only in a deep freeze, as we talked about, but it is in a stage of confrontation very much akin to where we were during the Cold War period. It is something which, regardless of what's going to happen on the battlefield, even if this war ends with ceasefire agreement, the damage that has been done to the perceptions of Russia, particularly among the countries that used to give it the benefit of the doubt, and advocated, certain degree of cooperation or compromises. I think that is all gone. So there is no one anymore arguing for that. So we are going to see, really decoupling between Russia and the West, and a kind of the new dividing line in Europe, which is going to emerge. The second one is that clearly NATO has become stronger than ever before, and we are going to see again in the new strategic concept this summer return towards territorial defense and kind of NATO's core business of defending Europe very much at the center. And we've seen this war already making remarkable advances in terms of European security. Germany has announced they're going to increase their defense spending, something which was again inconceivable. Both Finland and Sweden are talking about joining NATO. We're going to see major new deployments and strengthening the resilience and security of countries along Russia's borders. So that is, again, in my view, irreversible, regardless of how this conflict is going to end. The third, issue, of course, is that Russia itself is now going to be in a completely different situation in terms of its own ambitions than where it was before the war. We all know, of course, that we're in the last cycle now of this, fossil fuel economy with the climate change and renewables, etc. It is maybe this next decade is the last chance for Russia to try to take advantage of all this, major revenues that Russia is receiving from its fossil fuels to be able to maybe diversify and develop some other economy. We now know that this is not going to happen. Russia is now, completely disconnected from the global economy, from all the key technologies. All the major companies are now ending their presence in Russia. So that is going to be a period of consolidation and perhaps, much greater economic and technological drift towards China, for Russia, something which is definitely not in the long run be in the interests of Russia's, economic development and becoming kind of an independent pole of power globally. Again, this is, in my view, a given, regardless of how this conflict is going to end. And finally, I think if we look at the countries along Russia, around Russia's borders, of course, many of them, we still have areas of security vacuums, Belarus, what is going to happen there? Again, it's almost inconceivable at the moment to think that Russia will withdraw its forces or, is going to respect the sovereignty of Belarus, Next, what is going to happen in Kazakhstan, with the various ambitions that Russia has around its own, Russian-speaking population there. So, there's lots of issues that this instability, clearly, we've seen that none of those countries supported Russia in its military action and its recognition of the so-called republics. So there will be a big reshaping of this post-Soviet space. There will be massive rupture of relationship with the West and much greater gravitational pull in the relationship between Russia and China.
Thank you. Vladimir, would you mind also engaging with the question of where you think this all will end?
Yeah, I would agree with Oksana in two major respects. First and foremost, China is the greatest beneficiary of this conflict, as China, diverted all the global anger toward Russia, and now seem to be a kind of peaceful country which has a certain leverage of influence on Russia. And despite all the tensions China have with the US and with the EU, certainly China not welcomed Russian aggression, as it may cause numerous economic problems for the entire world, at least in the short run. I would agree that actually there is a process of rebuilding of NATO, reunification of Europe. There is no more strong dividing lines within the EU with regard to policy toward Russia. But speaking more broadly, I would see the current crisis as a sort of window of opportunity for rebuilding of global democracy. Now it became clear how dangerous is authoritarianism. And an authoritarian appeal, which was behind many recent advancements of populist leaders, ranging from Donald Trump to Bolsonaro in Brazil, is now very much problematic. And I would expect that there will be no longer, well, pro-Russian populists in Europe, like Marine Le Pen in France, and even more generally, this so-called the wave of autocratization, as some scholars put it, may be turned to a different direction. And this rebuilding of the best may be a sort of side effect of Russian invasion to Ukraine and Russian aggression. The image of authoritarianism nowadays is so ugly and so dangerous that there is probably no way to advocate authoritarianism in many places in the world. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dana, please.
I might be the most, I won't say the most humble, but the most timid about laying out the scenarios and the predictions for very long. I mean, a lot has happened. A lot of surprising things perhaps have happened since this war started, but it's, what are we in, day 6? So I think probably from my perspective, the most fruitful thing to do is to look at the dynamics we have seen in those past few days, which are different from maybe what some people expected. So I think we've already talked about the impressive way that, you know, German discourse has changed. I mean, Chancellor Scholz's speech was quite impressive and quite self-examining in terms of certain German traditions, and I take it very seriously. The European Union has been united, NATO has been united. I mean, all of these things I think reflect, kind of do refute the idea that there's a fundamental decline or addiction to illusions or anything like that. So, you know, all of this, I think we can imagine being carried on into the future, although that we don't know the political dynamics if Germany or other European countries face, you know, very severe energy crunches and other kinds of energy shortages and other kinds of sacrifices. You know, I mean, the future of the Western alliance, again, it does seem to be. I mean, if you're in favor of a strong future of the Western alliance, one would be heartened by recent days. But one reason why one is timid about making predictions is I'm not willing to predict that Donald Trump won't be president again in 4 years. You know, this brings me to the case that I think you probably should take a sophisticated and nuanced view towards the idea, towards, for example, French aspirations for greater European cohesion and autonomy. Autonomy doesn't have to mean separation, but it does mean a certain resilience against not only things like shocking threats from the East, but unknown futures in the United States. And finally, Oksana spoke about a return really to Russian isolation and a kind of Cold War. And I don't think we've quite imagined what that might look like. I mean, as a long-term proposition, is it really possible for a thorough decoupling of economic relations between Russia and Western Europe in particular? I mean, I suppose it is. But then the question becomes, if Russia is therefore forced upon the Chinese option, if you can imagine a Russian decoupling from Western economies, can you imagine a Chinese decoupling from Western economies? I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. But the further thing I will say is that I agree with Vladimir that the notion that authoritarianism is the wave of the future has been tarnished by a revelation of what it looks like in regard to a neighboring country.
Thank you so much, Philip. Do you want to start us off with the first question from the audience?
Yes, actually, we do have questions on China. One question by Christian Santos Rasmussen is on how all this is viewed by China, who has publicly been quite vague on its support to Russia. And related to that, Joel Henderson asks, what the war in the Ukraine implies for China's relation with Taiwan. Does it make a military conflict over Taiwan more or less likely? I don't know who wants to go first. Dana.
Sure, I'll go first. The Chinese reaction and position is very interesting, and I had an exchange a couple days ago with a colleague, more knowledgeable than I am, who pointed out the real question is, what did Xi know and when did he know it? It seems likely, I mean, I have no idea, obviously, but it seems likely that President Putin really did not tell him what was about to happen. It puts China, I think, in an uncomfortable position, partly because of what I was saying just a moment ago, which is that the idea that an authoritarian superpower like China is at least devoted to stability, some sort of rules-based order, just with more Chinese say in the nature of those rules, but is presenting itself as a stabilizing future rather than a destabilizing one, is much less compelling to the extent that China is associated with this monstrosity. So I don't think it can be comfortable for China. As far as Taiwan goes, I don't really think I want to make many predictions about the ramifications, except to suggest, I mean, on the one hand, Ukraine may be, may be crushed, but one doesn't imagine the Ukrainians giving up, and a long-term insurrection is something the Chinese might think about vis-a-vis Taiwan, even if there wasn't a direct American intervention to prevent their taking Taiwan. And the second thing is that they may be unpleasantly, if they're thinking about the Taiwan comparison, they may be given pause by the strong global, particularly European reaction to what's happening in Ukraine. The idea that a fait accompli, I mean, this isn't a fait accompli, but the idea that a fait accompli would be just, shrugged off by the rest of the world looks unlikely.
Vladimir, you want to add to that?
Yeah, in general, I would agree with Dana that, China may weighting its strategy toward Taiwan in the light of Russia's experience toward Ukraine. And I don't think that lessons China may learn from Russia's experience would encourage Chinese leadership to follow Russia's path. Actually, Russia faced with so severe political and economic and military problems that probably such an experience would be considered unacceptable. But as I noted previously, China maybe benefited from the current conflict of being probably the only global power which may exert the major influence. And I would not exclude that China will be a peacemaker rather than EU, for example, or let alone the US. But again, it's hard to make any immediate predictions as we are just in the very beginning of this ongoing bloody conflict. Thank you.
Dana?
The only other thing I wanted to say was that I remembered as we were discussing this, that one of the, I've been the editor of the journal I edit for quite a number of years now. And one of the first pieces I edited was by Michael Mandelbaum in 1999 under the title, "Is Major War Obsolete?" And in somewhat, may have been 98, I can't remember, but in any event, in somewhat, a Fukuyama moment, his answer was yes. And he described in very compelling terms a lot of reasons why major war, it wasn't impossible, war hadn't gone away, but major war was becoming obsolescent. But one key point he made at the end of this article is that there are two places that could bring major war back. And one was Ukraine and the other was Taiwan. And he was, making this very clear point more than, well, almost a quarter of a century ago. So I should acknowledge that.
Great. Stephanie, do we have any more questions?
Yes. On the topic of that, actually, right? I mean, so we see now war waging in different parts of the world, not only in Ukraine, but what makes this war particular, if one can say this, is that there's a nuclear power that actually is the main aggressor and invader. And so Adrian Lutz asked, actually, how high are the risks of a nuclear escalation? And if I just might add just a tiny footnote, right? I don't know exactly what he means by nuclear escalation and what he envisages, but we could, for example, envisage not a nuclear bomb being dropped onto a city, but maybe Russia using a tactical nuclear bomb, dropping it in the waters, but just showing that it's willing to actually use nuclear weapons. So again, sorry, how high are the risks of nuclear escalations according to you? Dana, maybe you want to start?
Well, I'm not going to put a percentage number to the risk, but the risk is real. That's all I can say. I mean, it's and as I said earlier, this is why. I mean, there are other reasons, but this is a fundamental reason why NATO is not defending Ukraine directly, and why it won't. And I mean, I think it won't. You hear, I mean, not just from the wider fringes of Twitter. I mean, you hear people suggesting that no-fly zones, which seems to be the fallback from people who don't really know what that means, I think. But anything like that is proposing a direct war with Russia. And I think that's a bad proposal. And it's precisely for the reason that that nuclear escalation and a nuclear exchange is a risk. And as much of a risk probably since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, there have been obviously episodes since then, including the Able Archer scare in the early 1980s and the Yom Kippur War, in which US and Russian troops went on nuclear alert. Soviet troops went on nuclear alert. But I think the dangers here are as significant as they've been, since, as I say, since the early 1960s. And you know, the Biden administration, when President Putin made his statement about changing the readiness posture of Russia's nuclear forces, the Biden administration very specifically said, we're not going to do that, we don't need to do that, and we're not going to do anything to increase this danger.
Thank you. Vladimir, do you want to add something?
Yeah, the risks of nuclear escalation are very high, as Putin announced that he is willing to rely upon nuclear sources as a mean of conflict resolution. And there are opportunities for using nukes against Ukraine, or even for preemptive attack toward the US, as literally Putin announced that, well, Ukraine is just a puppet of the US, so actually it's not a war with Ukraine, but rather war with the US over Ukraine. To what extent these well, threats may be materialized, it's really difficult to say, as we don't know much what is inside of this black box, how military decisions are conducted and how they implemented. But I would say that Dana mentioned these comparisons with Cuban Missile Crisis. My understanding is that it is much more dangerous, as the decision of potential using of nuclear weapons may be done unilaterally without any taking into consideration a possible response, especially if Russia will use nukes against Ukraine. This is almost a guarantee that, well, the US will not use nukes in response. But I would not go into speculations on how it may occur.
Next, we have a question on the domestic situation in Russia. We already talked about the likelihood or lack thereof of a coup d'etat staged by the elites. Joris now asks about the probability of a popular uprising. More specifically, he asks, what do you think needs to happen for Russian population to rise? Vladimir.
Yeah, the major problem for popular uprising is the lack of organizations suitable for collective actions. During the previous years, the Kremlin put tremendous efforts into elimination of many NGOs, many bottom-up networks, and the like. And this is why numerous instances of protests were pretty much local, like environmental protests in certain areas, or some labor conflicts in certain enterprises, and the like. Definitely, the Kremlin aimed at minimizing of these risks. However, I would not exclude that further casualties of the war and further problems with the Russian economy may change the public opinion quite dramatically. And if so, then there will be a strong demand for political changes. Well, you know, public opinion in autocracies is something very much unpredictable. And we know that in East Germany before 1989, there was a high level of popular support of the status quo just several months before the fall of Berlin Wall. So I would not exclude a sort of new 1989 in Russia, but it's really difficult to predict. Now it looks like there is a sort of awakening of the Russian public, but awakening is too much slow and only affects certain social groups rather than Russian society at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Dana, you want to add to this?
I don't really, I'm not really qualified to assess this, but I will apply a kind of historical heuristic to the effect that, you know, whatever the likely future evolution of Russian politics and Russian public opinion, it's not really something that adversaries should count on in their strategic calculations. I mean, you know, we've done that before, and it's usually not a good idea. Now, obviously, the very punitive sanction regime that's been instituted is you know, going some way towards crashing the Russian economy, or at least the Russian financial system and the Russian ruble. And that's likely to have an effect. Whether it turns the population against the regime, I don't know, but or whether it leads to real disaffection as opposed to anger towards the West, I don't know. One does get the sense that Russian popular support for this war, that the Russian people are kind of shocked by it too. So that will be a factor. The sanctions are obviously also aimed against individuals and strata of the Russian elite, and whether you know that can affect Russian policy is unknown.
Thank you, Stephanie.
There's so many great questions out there. So again, thank you so much for posting all of those. I think this just shows that this should be just the beginning of a conversation that we're having. And just to remind you, there'll be other events on Thursday and on Friday at the EUI, for example, as in many other places. So please keep the conversation going. But we're scholars, we're analysts, but of course we're also, if you want, citizens of the world. And so I would like to ask the question by Dimtro Kutki, who asked us to shift away from the analysis of what is to actually ask what can we do now to help Ukraine. and asking us like if you have potential ideas as to how to communicate those to decision makers in the EU or the US or worldwide. So this is an action-oriented question. I don't know who want to tackle it first, Dana or Vladimir, please.
Since I didn't turn my mute on, unfortunately, I'll go. I mean, unfortunately, I'm not really going to answer that, because I think the burden of my remarks today has been that the Western governments are doing a pretty good job, and I'm not sure what I'd advise them to do more. There are obviously things that individuals can do in terms of supporting the humanitarian plight of Ukrainians, limited things given that they're under attack. I live in London, in Britain, and I don't think that the British immigration authorities or government have so far covered themselves in glory in terms of how they're interpreting what they're going to do in terms of accepting Ukrainian refugees. So I would, I would certainly encourage. I'm not a citizen of this country, but I'm a taxpayer here, and I think that the United Kingdom government, UK government, should be very welcoming to Ukrainian refugees. Other than that, I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, in my view, European governments did a good job in offering some opportunities for refugees and people in Europe, particularly in countries close to Ukraine, like Poland and Slovakia, was major credentials for grassroots assistance to individuals. Of course, migration issue is certainly important, and definitely Ukrainian refugees could be and should be very much welcomed in Europe, and I believe that there will be a major advantage for Europeans of having new residents who are, I would say, very much educated, tend to work hard, and there should be not so large cultural distance in comparison with refugees from other parts of the world. So that's for sure. The most difficult question for the EU is not immediate, because as everybody knows, Ukraine officially applied for EU membership. Definitely East European governments endorsed this application, but I just wonder to what extent the EU and some national governments of the EU countries, first and foremost, Germany and France, will respond. Because apparently Ukraine is a big country which is not in a position of operating in the full scale, at least before there will be a sort of ceasefire and appeasement, and this will be a certain challenge for the EU and for member states how to proceed with that. However, the very willingness of the EU to consider these issues give some sort of hope for Ukrainians. I don't expect that Ukraine will be EU member even if there will be the best possible scenario in, say, next 5 to 10 years. There is a lot of work ahead, even after the war. But this issue have to be resolved. Thank you.
We have reached the end of our webinar. I would like to thank our 3 panelists, Dana, Vladimir, and Oksana, for their time and for their great insights and contributions. I would also like to thank our audience for their attention and their great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't address them all. The events on Thursday and on Friday may give the opportunity to ask some of the questions that hadn't been addressed today. So again, thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon and stand by Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini is the slogan of Ukrainians now.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.